What happens when two hungry little girls, desperate for food, dial a random number and reach a millionaire CEO? This is not just a story about wealth, it's about kindness, fate, and how a single call can change lives forever. Stay with us as we take you on an emotional journey filled with suspense, heartbreak, and the healing power of love. Because sometimes the smallest voices can touch the biggest hearts. The city outside buzzed with life, cars honking, neon lights flashing, laughter spilling from restaurants. But inside one small apartment, silence ruled. A silence heavy enough to crush the hearts of two little girls. Emma, only 7, hugged her younger sister Sophie tightly. Their thin blanket barely kept away the cold that crept through the cracks in the walls. Their stepmother had left earlier, her footsteps echoing down the hallway without a single glance back. She hadn't bothered to cook or leave food. Emma's stomach growled painfully. She pressed her tiny hand against it, pretending it didn't hurt. Sophie, just 6 years old, rubbed her eyes and whispered, "I'm hungry, Emma." Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and weakness. Emma's eyes welled up. She was only a child herself, yet she felt the heavy burden of being the protector. "What if," she whispered, her voice fragile yet determined. "What if we call someone? Maybe they'll help us." Sophie blinked at her, uncertain. "But who?" Emma glanced at the old telephone sitting on the dusty table. It was barely used, but tonight it felt like their only hope. "Anyone," she said softly. Maybe someone kind will answer." Sophie's little fingers shook as she lifted the receiver. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She pressed random numbers, not even knowing what she was dialing. Each beep echoed like a cry for help into the emptiness of the night. On the third try, someone answered. "Hello?" The voice was deep, firm, controlled, used to power. But Sophie's breath hitched. She clutched the receiver tighter and whispered, almost too softly to hear, "We're hungry. Can you help us?" There was silence. On the other end, sitting in a towering glass office high above the glittering city, was Alexander Hayes, a 38-year-old billionaire CEO. Papers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, numbers glowing from his laptop screen. His world was normally filled with contracts, deals, and deadlines, but in that instant, everything froze. He leaned back in his leather chair, stunned. His pen slipped from his hand. He wasn't used to weakness. He had built his empire by crushing it. But now, through the thin line of a telephone, he heard the fragile cry of a child. His first thought was disbelief. "Is this a prank?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Then he heard it, the faint sniffle of a child trying not to cry. The desperation, the raw truth in that tiny voice couldn't be faked. Sophie whispered again, "Please, we don't want toys. We just want food." Alexander's heart slammed against his chest. A memory he had buried long ago clawed its way back. His own childhood, sitting hungry in a dark room, waiting for a father who never returned. He had promised himself he would never feel weak again. But here it was, unfolding before him, not in his life, but in the lives of two innocent children. His chest tightened. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the billionaire CEO felt powerless. Not because he lacked resources, but because two trembling voices had pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. He leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly, his voice gentler now. "Where are you?" he asked. But the girls didn't know their address well. All Sophie could manage was, "We live near the corner store, the one with the red sign." Alexander's decision was immediate. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't think twice. He rose from his chair, grabbed his coat, and left the tower of glass behind. For the first time in years, his wealth, his empire, his reputation, none of it mattered. All that mattered were two hungry voices that had reached him by chance. But deep in his heart, Alexander knew. This wrong number wasn't a mistake. It was fate. Alexander Hayes was not a man easily shaken. He had faced ruthless competitors, cold negotiations, and million-dollar risks without blinking. But the moment that fragile, trembling voice whispered through the receiver, something inside him fractured. At first, his brow furrowed. His instinct told him it was some childish prank. He pressed the phone closer and said sharply, "Who is this? Do you know who you're calling?" His tone carried the weight of authority that could silence entire boardrooms. But the silence on the other end wasn't playful, it was broken. Then came a soft sniffle, a tiny breath between tears, and then words so raw they pierced his chest. "Please, we don't want toys, we just want food." The words echoed in his head, cutting through the armor he had built over years of power. His office, with its towering glass walls and glittering skyline view, suddenly felt hollow. The spreadsheets, contracts, and reports sprawled across his desk, all meaningless compared to that plea. He leaned back slowly, as if the weight of the moment was pushing him into his chair. For years, he had thought his wealth made him invincible. Yet in that second, two invisible children made him feel smaller than ever. His throat tightened. He remembered being a boy, sitting alone in a cold apartment much like theirs, waiting for a parent who never came. He had learned early that hunger didn't just live in your stomach, it carved itself into your soul. That memory, buried deep beneath success and pride, rose like a ghost to haunt him. His voice softened, gentler than he had spoken in years. "Where are you?" he asked. His tone, once sharp with suspicion, was now almost pleading. But the girls didn't know their address. Their words were broken, uncertain. Sophie whispered, "We live near the corner store. The one with the red sign." Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose, his mind racing. Most people would have dismissed it, hung up, or called someone else to deal with it. But Alexander Hayes was not most people. Not anymore. He stood abruptly, his chair sliding back. His reflection in the glass wall caught his eye. An expensive suit, a hardened face, a man who had everything but warmth. He hated what he saw in that moment. For years he had lived in numbers and deals, and yet here were two children, strangers, making him question everything. He didn't call security. He didn't contact his driver. He didn't summon an assistant. Instead, with urgency in his steps, he grabbed his coat and keys. His empire could wait. His meetings could wait. Tonight, nothing was more important than those voices. As he rushed out of his skyscraper, the night air hit him like a slap. The city glittered with wealth, but he knew somewhere nearby, two children were sitting in darkness, with nothing but empty stomachs and fading hope. His luxury car roared to life, but his thoughts weren't on the leather seats or the gleaming dashboard. They were on Sophie's tiny voice and Emma's silence in the background. For the first time in years, Alexander wasn't thinking about money, deals, or power. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't inside the walls of his empire. It was with two little girls who had dialed the wrong number. But deep in his heart, as his hands tightened on the steering wheel, he knew this wasn't a wrong number at all. It was destiny knocking at his door, softly, trembling, but impossible to ignore. The car stopped in front of an aging apartment building. Alexander stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against gravel and broken glass scattered near the entrance. The building stood like a forgotten shell, its bricks cracked, its paint faded, its windows clouded with grime. For a man used to marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers, the sight was jarring. But he didn't pause to judge. His heart was racing with a single thought. The girls are here. The stairwell reeked of dust and dampness. Each creak of the steps echoed in the silence as he climbed. He finally reached the door, described vaguely by Sophie. His hand hesitated in the air for a moment, then knocked firmly. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet corridor. Seconds stretched. He was about to knock again when the door cracked open, slowly, cautiously, as though the ones behind it had learned to fear what waited outside. Two pairs of eyes peeked out, wide, frightened, uncertain. Emma's small face appeared first, her lips trembling. Sophie stood half hidden behind her sister, clutching the edge of her dress. Alexander's breath caught. Their clothes were worn thin, sleeves frayed, too small for their growing bodies. Their cheeks were pale, their hair unbrushed, their expressions filled with a mix of hope and terror. "You came," Emma whispered. Her voice was so soft it might have been the wind, yet it struck him harder than any corporate insult ever had. The disbelief in her tone cut deep, as though she had never expected anyone to keep a promise, never expected anyone to come when she called. His chest tightened painfully. "Of course I came," he murmured. The girls slowly opened the door wider, revealing the apartment. Inside was emptiness. No toys, no food on the counter, no warmth. Just a threadbare blanket spread on the floor where the girls had been sitting to keep from the cold. Alexander stepped inside carefully, his polished shoes feeling almost wrong on the cracked linoleum floor. He took it all in, the bare cupboards, the silence, the loneliness that clung to the air like a shadow. He turned back to the girls, and in that instant, memories from his own past surged forward. He remembered being left in a room just like this, waiting for a father who never returned. He remembered the promise he had whispered to himself as a boy, that he would never be weak again, never be abandoned again. But here were children, weaker than he had ever been, living through the very nightmare he had once survived. His voice came out rougher than intended. "Where's your mother?" Emma's gaze dropped to the floor. Her tiny shoulders shook as she whispered, "She doesn't care." Those 3 words hit him like a blow. He clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. A storm of anger rose inside him, not at the children, but at the woman who could abandon them. He wanted to slam the door, storm into the night, and find her. He wanted to demand answers, demand justice. But when he looked down again, all he saw were 2 fragile little girls staring up at him, needing someone to choose them, needing someone to fight for them. He forced himself to kneel, lowering his tall frame until his eyes met theirs. He softened his expression, hiding the rage burning inside. His voice was low, steady, protective. "No one should ever treat you this way," he whispered. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Sophie clutched her sister tighter. They had heard promises before, but this felt different. His words didn't sound like empty air. They sounded like truth. And in that moment, Alexander Hayes, the man who had spent years building walls around his heart, felt those walls begin to crumble. This door, this night, these 2 children. They were not interruptions to his life. They were the beginning of something he had never dared to hope for. Alexander didn't drive them to a glittering tower with glass chandeliers or silver-plated menus. He didn't want the girls to feel out of place. Instead, he stopped in front of a modest family restaurant tucked on a quiet street. Its windows glowed warmly, and the scent of fresh bread drifted into the night air. The girls followed him hesitantly, their small hands gripping his coat sleeve. They weren't used to strangers keeping promises, and walking into a restaurant with a man they had just met felt like stepping into another world. The bell above the door jingled softly as they entered. Inside, the restaurant was cozy. Checkered tablecloths, shelves lined with jars of pickles and sauces, and a kind-eyed woman behind the counter who smiled at them. For Alexander, who usually dined at places where waiters bowed at his presence, this humble warmth felt strangely perfect. He guided Emma and Sophie to a booth by the window. They slid into the seats nervously, eyes darting around the room as if afraid someone would tell them to leave. Alexander sat across from them, his tall figure seeming almost out of place in such a simple setting. The waitress came with menus, but the girls didn't even open them. Their eyes were fixed on the smell of food drifting from the kitchen. Alexander noticed and ordered for them without hesitation. Warm soup, fresh bread, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a slice of pie for dessert. When the plates arrived, steam rising, the girls froze. Their eyes went wide at the sight of the food. For them, it wasn't just dinner. It was a miracle. Sophie reached out first, her small hands trembling as she picked up a piece of bread. She took a bite so cautiously, as if afraid it would vanish. Then another. Suddenly her lips quivered, and tears rolled silently down her cheeks. "It's so good," she whispered between bites, her voice cracking under the weight of gratitude. Emma sat across, watching her sister eat before daring to try herself. She picked up a fork, cut a tiny piece of chicken, and placed it in her mouth. Her eyes softened. Then she turned to Alexander, her little voice breaking through the quiet hum of the restaurant. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." The question stabbed him deeper than he expected. For a man who had bought companies, silenced rivals, and faced ruthless decisions, he suddenly found himself speechless before a child. His throat tightened, and he leaned forward, speaking softly. "Because someone should have helped me when I was your age, and no child should ever have to beg for food." Emma blinked at him, her eyes glistening as if trying to understand how a powerful man like him could once have been small and hungry too. Alexander didn't rush them. He didn't check his watch or glance at his phone. He sat patiently, cutting their food into smaller pieces, sliding napkins across the table when their hands grew messy, making sure they ate until their little stomachs were full. The restaurant owner, a man with gray hair and kind eyes, leaned against the counter, quietly watching the scene unfold. He knew who Alexander Hayes was. Everyone in the city did. But tonight, the billionaire wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or assistants. He wasn't talking deals or flashing wealth. He was just a man, sitting with two hungry children, serving them as if they were his own. Other diners noticed too. They whispered, but not in judgment. There was awe in their voices. For in a world where most would walk past hungry children without a glance, here was a man with everything choosing to sit at a humble table and share bread with the forgotten. As Sophie leaned against the booth, her belly finally full, she smiled sleepily. Emma placed her fork down and whispered almost shyly, "Thank you." Alexander felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride or pity, it was something far deeper. For the first time in years, he felt alive, not because of wealth or power, but because two little girls trusted him enough to whisper gratitude through trembling voices. And in that small family restaurant, with the scent of fresh bread lingering in the air, walls began to melt, not just the walls around the girls' fragile hearts, but the cold, guarded walls Alexander had built around his own. When Alexander drove the girls to his estate, the gates swung open to reveal a mansion that had once stood like a silent fortress. Its marble pillars gleamed under the moonlight, its gardens stretched endlessly. And yet, until now, it had been nothing more than an empty monument to wealth. Emma and Sophie's eyes widened as the car rolled up the long driveway. Sophie pressed her face to the window. "It looks like a castle," she whispered in awe. Emma, holding her sister's hand, stared with a mixture of wonder and fear. Castles, she thought, were for fairy tales, not for girls like them. Alexander stepped out first, extending his hand with unusual gentleness. "Come on," he said softly, his voice almost uncertain as though afraid they might refuse. But their small fingers slipped into his, and in that simple touch, something inside him eased. He led them inside, past the grand staircase, the crystal chandeliers, and the tall windows draped in velvet. Normally, this house was silent, so silent that even his footsteps often sounded lonely. But now, two pairs of small shoes tapped against the polished floors, echoing like music. Emma and Sophie gasped at the sight of the vast hall. They had never seen ceilings so high or carpets so soft beneath their feet. Tentatively at first, then with growing boldness, they ran across the room, their giggles bouncing off the marble walls. Alexander leaned against the doorway, watching. He had bought priceless paintings, rare antiques, and everything money could acquire. But nothing had ever filled this mansion with warmth the way those two little voices did. For the first time, the cold house felt alive. The guest house was prepared quickly. A cozy space, stocked with fresh sheets, warm blankets, and a little basket of toys Alexander had ordered while driving back. He hadn't bought them because of obligation. He bought them because something inside him wanted to see joy in their eyes. That evening, dinner was served not in the grand dining hall, but in the smaller breakfast room. Emma and Sophie sat at the table, swinging their feet above the floor as Alexander poured them milk himself, ignoring the staff who stood by, surprised at his sudden change. Afterward, when the girls grew drowsy, he walked them to the guest house. He tucked Sophie into bed, pulling the blanket gently up to her chin. She clutched his hand suddenly, her little fingers refusing to let go. Her wide eyes shimmered in the soft light. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" she whispered. The question struck him harder than any corporate betrayal ever had. He swallowed, his throat tight. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice steady but his heart shaking. "I'll always be here." Emma, already drifting into sleep, turned on her side with the faintest smile. Sophie's hand loosened its grip only when she was sure of his words. Alexander remained sitting there for a long while, listening to the sound of their breathing. He realized that for years he had thought success was measured in profits and towers of glass. But here, in a quiet guest house with 2 sleeping children, he discovered a new definition. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He wasn't just a man of wealth and power. For the first time in years, he was something far more important. He was someone's protector. And as he stepped outside, the echo of their laughter still dancing in his ears, Alexander Hayes smiled to himself. His mansion was no longer just stone and marble. It was finally becoming a home. Weeks turned into months. Alexander went to court and fought for custody. The judge, seeing the truth of neglect, granted him guardianship. The girls were no longer abandoned. They had a father figure who loved them. The mansion was transformed, not by wealth, but by love. Alexander found himself sitting on the floor, building blocks, teaching Emma how to ride a bike, and holding Sophie's hand when she had bad dreams. He realized something powerful. Money can build towers, but only love can build a home. And when neighbors and strangers asked why a billionaire CEO would take in 2 poor girls, his answer was simple. Because children don't need to earn love. They deserve it, no matter where they come from. The lesson echoed. In a society where many walk past the hungry, kindness can change a life. Sometimes even a wrong number can lead to the right heart. Heartwarming ending. The girls found a father they never had, and Alexander found the family he never knew he needed. Together they proved that love, not wealth, creates true happiness.